Open the podcast bay doors, Hal.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 30 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits. But I've found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider to be the requisite knowledge in order to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. Before we get started on the topic for this episode, I'd like to read a note I got from listener Ricky G about the last 2 episodes discussing the economy of the Star Trek Federation. She messaged me on Facebook and said, quote, "Hey there, I still love your podcast. I listened to your episodes on Star Trek economics. I think your view that humans are greedy by nature is Eurocentric. Lots of Native American and African societies are what anthropologists call collectivist, and individual greed is frowned upon and rather unusual." End quote. That's a great point, Ricky. I should have brought that up in my discussion with Matt Dobra. It does show that greed is not necessarily an innate human characteristic, as Matt, and the rules of acquisition, say. However, since the society of Earth in Star Trek seems to be based off of a Eurocentric point of view, that is the society that would have to change to be more collectivist. I certainly hope we can get there one day, as I see the society that Gene Roddenberry created as an ideal to reach for. I also reached back out to Dr. Dobra to see if he wanted to respond. He pushed back some on Ricky's message, writing the following. Quote, "First, I'm not sure if there's anything essentially Eurocentric about that view. While it is true that self-interest as a primary motivator of human action has a long tradition in Western thought, e.g. Bentham, Epicureanism, hedonism, etc., the idea of egoism is part of many heterodox Eastern philosophies, such as classical Chinese, Yangism, and Hindi, Charvaka thought. Second, the fact that some societies frown upon self-interested behavior does not mean that people are not self-interested. Collectivist social norms are not incompatible with the idea that behavior is self-interested. It's easy to argue that self-interested people living within a collectivist society would find it in their self-interest to temper or hide their self-interested behavior. That said, my argument wasn't that self-interest is good, rather that self-interest exists and plays a significant role in human behavior. Finally, I would not argue that human behavior is 100% self-interested. Some actions would be almost impossible to explain if that were true, e.g. soldiers jumping on grenades to save their friends. I don't know exactly what that number is, maybe it's 75% or 50%, who knows, but I'm pretty confident that it isn't anywhere close to 0%, and pretty close to 0% is what I think you would need for a Star Trek economy to function as portrayed on the screen. End quote. Remember, if you want to discuss the show with myself or with other listeners, you can do that on Facebook or on Twitter. I'm always glad to get the feedback, and thank you again for writing in, Ricky. Now, let's move on to this week's topic. As I write this episode, Avengers Endgame surpassed Titanic to be the second biggest worldwide box office, and it's only in its 3rd week of release. But thanks to a comment left by Ryan C. on Facebook a while back, I want to talk about another shared universe. One that has spanned film, television, video games, and comic books for over 25 years. I'm talking about the DC Animated Universe, or DCAU for short. Let's look at some of the history behind the creation of what was, for many, the defining version of some of the world's greatest characters. Animation takes a while to create, so although it wasn't until 1992 that the show first aired on Fox, work on Batman the Animated Series started in 1990, inspired by the success of Tim Burton's live-action movie. Paul Dini, Bruce Timm, and Eric Radomski are credited as the show's co-creators. Dini and Timm went on to work on pretty much every future project in the DCAU, and fans will often refer to the DCAU as either the Diniverse or Timmverse. Bruce and Eric are the most responsible for the look of the show, with Dini being one of the most involved writers. While we're talking about those responsible, I would be remiss to leave out writer and producer Alan Burnett and voice director Andrea Romano. They both also continued their involvement in the DCAU basically up to the present day, and deserve credit as well for their contributions to the shows and movies involved. The original Batman the Animated Series run lasted for 3 years. This first Batman run concentrated more on street-level crime, and only had a couple of villains who would qualify as having superpowers, Clayface and Killer Croc. They also introduced very few characters outside of Batman's supporting cast and rogues gallery. The two exceptions to that were Jonah Hex, in a flashback that took place in the Old West involving Ra's al Ghul, and Zatanna, whose father trained Bruce Wayne as an escape artist before Bruce became Batman. Zatanna was not shown to have actual magic, however, until her appearances in Justice League Unlimited, which we'll get to later, and was simply a stage magician. In addition to bringing new life to characters like Mr. Freeze, whose origin story from the show was later brought into the comics, Dini, Timm, and the rest of the creators also added new characters who have become so popular as to be added into the main DC Comics continuity. This includes Lockup, Detective Renee Montoya, and the best known of all, Harley Quinn, the Joker's sidekick who has grown into a full-fledged character in her own right. Batman the Animated Series went on to win daytime and primetime Emmys for their work, and with that success, the team then turned its eye to the second half of the world's finest team, Superman. Whereas Batman focused on dark, moody stories, the show was actually animated on black paper in order to help set that mood, Superman's world was bright and optimistic. And with the lead character being a superpowered being, it was easier to introduce other characters with powers and have them play off of each other. In addition to crossing characters with the Batman show 3 times during its 3-season run, Superman the Animated Series also introduced the Flash, the Green Lantern Corps, Aquaman, Lobo, and Dr. Fate, in addition to superheroes in the Superman family like Steel and Supergirl. Lobo, a popular character at the time, got his own web series in 2000, which you can find on YouTube, although I wouldn't recommend it for younger viewers. Concurrently running with Superman, the animation team was also working on The New Batman Adventures, which continued off the Batman animated series, but with a slightly simpler, more stylized animation, and more of a focus on the side characters like Robin, Nightwing, and Batgirl. Etrigan the Demon and the Creeper are the 2 non-Bat characters that had their introduction into the DCU, each getting an episode named for them during this New Batman Adventures. The show also moved networks, with Warner Brothers, the parent company of DC, now owning the WB network, later to merge with UPN to become the CW, on which Superman and the New Batman Adventures aired back-to-back as the Batman-Superman Adventures. With 7 years of Batman under their belt, Dini, Timm, and the rest were asked to create a new show with a teenage protagonist. Placing the show in a cyberpunk future allowed them to keep Kevin Conroy's Bruce Wayne as a mentor figure to the new Batman, Terry McGinnis, in the show Batman Beyond. The writers and animators really got to flex their creative juices on this show, since nearly all of the heroes and villains were created from scratch, rather than being adapted from an existing canon. Batman Beyond continued the creative team's winning streak at both the Daytime Emmys and the Annies, an award show dedicated to animation on film and television, and even got a 2-season spin-off called The Zeta Project. This show had a very similar premise to the Incredible Hulk live-action TV show, as it was a superpowered being on the run who would end up helping out as he wandered from town to town, staying one step ahead of the authorities who were after him for a crime he didn't commit. But in this case, the being was a humanoid robot, rather than the Hulk. Back to Batman Beyond. In addition to the 3-season run the show had on TV, there was also a full-length movie made and released to video titled Return of the Joker. While the show was aimed at a teen audience, the movie went very dark, to the point of having an unrated version released a year later. I highly recommend it for those who were fans of the original Batman the Animated Series, but be forewarned going in that it goes to some disturbing places, including torture. Return of the Joker was not the only feature-length film set in the DCAU. To date, 6 movies have been made that are part of the Diniverse. The first on that list was Batman: Mask of the Phantasm. It was the only one of those that was actually released in movie theaters, rather than go straight to video. After I discussed the Batman films in episode 25, I was taken to task for leaving out Mask of the Phantasm, as it often places high, if not on the top of, the list of best Batman films. However, for that show, I was talking only about live-action adaptations. Now that I'm talking animation, I do agree with other critics who rank the movie as high as they do. The entire DCAU started with Batman, and got him just right all the way through, including this movie that splits its time between quote-unquote modern day and flashing back to Bruce's younger years. Unfortunately, for various reasons not having to do with its quality, the film underperformed at the box office, and so all subsequent movies in this continuity have gone straight to video, including the most recent movie, Justice League vs. the Fatal Five, which just came out this year and added the Legion of Superheroes to the list of DC heroes that have been made part of the Timverse. I want to get to Justice League and its sequel, Justice League Unlimited, or JLU, but we have one more stop along the way, and it's an interesting one. Static is a character that was created in 1993 for Milestone Media by Dwayne McDuffie, Dennis Cowan, Michael Davis, and Derek Dingle. Milestone Comics were published by DC, but were under a separate imprint and were not part of the mainstream DC continuity, as DC did not actually own the rights to these characters. Unfortunately, with the comic bust of the late 90s, Milestone shut down their comics division in 1997. However, the character of Static, a teen superhero with electrical powers, similar in character to Spider-Man, i.e. shy and nerdy at school and home, but witty and jokey when in costume, was popular enough to be optioned for an animated show titled Static Shock, which began airing in 2000. Because of their tie to DC, Static Shock was able to have guest starring appearances from DC characters like Batman, Superman, and the rest. The show won an Emmy and was even awarded the Humanitas Prize in 2003. At least partially due to the success of this show, Static and the rest of the Milestone characters have come back, with DC purchasing the rights in order to bring them into the main comic continuity. Finally, as promised, we have the big guns, Justice League. With Batman and Superman's solo shows no longer airing new episodes at this point, the writers were able to move forward with those characters' stories without having to worry about contradicting themselves in another show. And having introduced Batman, Superman, The Flash, and Green Lantern into the DCAU, it was only fitting that they team up. Although the Green Lantern we follow in Justice League was John Stewart rather than Hal Jordan, who was introduced in Superman. In addition to these four, Hawkgirl, Wonder Woman, and Martian Manhunter made up the original lineup for the Justice League. The show lasted for 2 long seasons, between late 2001 and mid-2004, ending with a climactic battle against the Thanagarians for the fate of the world. This led straight into the sequel show, Justice League Unlimited. Instead of just 7 heroes in the League, over 30 different heroes were recruited, many of whom received episodes spotlighting them. Huntress and Question, in particular, got a great story arc leading to a romance between the two. With its connected storytelling, sprawling cast, and drawing on both television and comics writers for their episodes, JLU is personally my favorite of the Diniverse shows, and one I'll go back to watch time and time again. However, the entire DCAU is impressive, and well worth a viewing if you haven't already done so. There have been other DC animated shows running alongside the ones I touched on in this episode of the podcast, including Teen Titans and Teen Titans Go, Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes, and Young Justice. However, since they contradict the canon of the shows that have been discussed, they're not considered part of the DCAU, although many of them are great in their own right. Would you like to hear about any of those other shows? Or perhaps you'd like me to dig deeper on some other topic, or just want to send me a comment about the show in general. You can do so by sending an email to me at welcometogeektown@gmail.com, or leave a comment directly on the show notes at www.welcome2, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcometogeektown or Twitter @geektownpodcast. Also, if you'd like to support the show directly, come join the Patreon at patreon.com/welcometogeektown, where for just $1 per month, you can get access to full scripts of the shows, outtakes, and a monthly shoutout. You can also help the show grow by subscribing and giving a 5-star review over on iTunes to join the Geektown City Council, which helps other people find the show, so we can all tell them, welcome to Geektown, population, us. Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair